The explosion shattered the emergency room doors at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would change everything. Sarah's hands froze mid-motion over the medication cart as the concussive blast rattled every window in Mercy General Hospital. The sound was deafening, not like the movies portrayed it, but visceral and absolute. Gunfire erupted immediately after, a staccato thunder that sent every instinct screaming at her body to flee. Around her, trained medical professionals descended into chaos. Nurses abandoned their stations. Patients screamed. A doctor dropped his tablet and ran toward the back corridors. The security guard at the main entrance returned fire for exactly 3 seconds before a burst of automatic weapons fire cut him down. His body crumpled like a discarded paper bag. But Sarah didn't run. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Instead, she moved with calculated precision, sliding behind the medication station and dropping to a crouch. Her heart rate remained steady, a skill trained into her over 12 years of military service. From her vantage point, she could observe everything: the tactical formation of the entering operatives, the weapons they carried, the way they communicated through hand signals and encrypted radios. Masked commandos poured through the smoke-filled entrance, their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance of violence. They wore modified Russian military gear, the kind that wasn't sold commercially, the kind that told her exactly who was financing this operation. This was team. After 731 days, exactly 2 years, of embedding herself in this hospital, pretending to be nothing more than a dedicated trauma nurse, Sarah's entire operation had reached its culmination. The largest operative, a man with cold eyes visible above his tactical mask, grabbed her arm with brutal force. His grip was strong enough to cut off circulation. "Where's security?" he demanded, his Russian accent thick and menacing. "Where are the patients?" Sarah's eyes widened with manufactured terror, a performance she perfected over 24 months. Her voice shook convincingly. "Second floor. They're evacuating staff through the back corridors. Please don't hurt me." The operative studied her face for a fraction of a second, a moment that felt like an eternity. Sarah knew that if he saw through her performance, if he recognized the training behind her eyes, she'd be dead before she hit the ground. But he didn't see it. No one ever saw it. That was the entire point of her assignment. He released her arm with a shove that sent her stumbling backward. "Stay here. Don't move. Don't call anyone." He pivoted toward the stairwell, barking orders to his team in rapid Russian. Sarah understood every word. They were securing floors 3 and 4. They were establishing a command post in the operating theater. They were positioning explosives on the main stairwell. This wasn't an improvised attack. It was a meticulously planned operation that had been coordinated for months. As the operative disappeared up the stairwell, Sarah's fingers moved with practiced subtlety to her left wrist. Her watch, a modified military-grade device that looked completely ordinary to anyone who wasn't trained to recognize it, contained sophisticated encryption technology and real-time satellite communication capabilities. She pressed the crown twice in rapid succession. The signal was encrypted, untraceable, and transmitted directly to a secure military frequency, monitored by Commander James Harrison's SEAL team, stationed in mobile units throughout the city. The message was simple: breach confirmed. VOLKOV Unit DPLOYED. Commence operation. Sarah's mind shifted into a state of awareness. The undercover operation that had defined the last 2 years of her life, the careful cultivation of relationships with hospital staff, the meticulous documentation of terrorist activity, the psychological manipulation required to gain trust through intelligence networks, had been preparation for this exact moment. She'd spent 731 days building credibility as a nurse, earning the respect of colleagues, gaining access to restricted areas, and learning every inch of this hospital's layout. Now came the part that would test everything. She stood slowly, composing herself, and began moving toward the patient care areas. Her movements were deliberately uncertain, the movements of a frightened civilian rather than a trained combat operative. Around her, chaos continued to unfold. Another explosion detonated on the fourth floor. Alarms screamed. The hospital's announcement system crackled to life with automated emergency protocols. Sarah moved through the panic like a ghost, her mind processing multiple streams of information simultaneously. She counted the operatives she'd observed, 7 distinct individuals. She assessed their weapons, AR-15s, tactical pistols, what appeared to be 4 fragmentation grenades. She noted their positioning. They were establishing a perimeter using the operating theater as their central stronghold. She observed their psychological state, professional, disciplined, but with underlying tension that suggested they were operating on a compressed timeline. Most importantly, she noticed the young operative in the corner, the one with sweating palms, the one whose hands trembled slightly as he secured the entrance. That one was the weak link. That one would break under pressure. That one would be the point of failure in their operation. And Sarah knew exactly how to exploit that weakness. She positioned herself among the terrified hostages being herded toward the surgical wing, her mind already calculating exit routes, structural vulnerabilities, and the precise timing required for the SEAL team's assault. The hunt had begun. The real battle was about to start, and Sarah, the nurse who was actually a decorated Navy SEAL, was about to make history, was a ghost, a name whispered in intelligence briefings that most people didn't believe was real. 32 years of service in Russia's GRU, orchestrating operations across 3 continents, leaving bodies in his wake but never a trace of evidence that could connect him to anything. He'd bombed a nightclub in Barcelona that killed 47 civilians. He'd coordinated an assassination in London that toppled a government alliance. He'd overseen the infiltration of critical infrastructure across Western Europe. And now, at 3:04 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, he was standing in the operating theater of Mercy General Hospital, with a tactical headset pressed against his ear and absolute control over 32 human lives. His team of 7 commandos moved with the precision of machines that had been trained together for years. No wasted motion, no unnecessary communication. They drilled this operation 17 times in an abandoned warehouse in New Jersey, memorizing every detail of the hospital's layout that Sarah had photographed and transmitted through classified channels. They knew exactly where the security cameras were located. They knew the optimal positions for explosives. They knew which corridors would be used for evacuation. They'd prepared for this operation with the methodical intensity of professionals who understood that every second of hesitation could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The first explosive detonated on the main stairwell at 3:06 p.m., exactly as planned. The blast severed the primary evacuation route and eliminated the possibility that hospital security could mount any organized response. The second explosive was rigged to the emergency stairwell exit on the eastern side of the building, blocking that route as well. The third and fourth explosives were positioned on the structural supports of the observation deck, overlooking the operating theater, a strategic placement that turned the surgical wing into an impenetrable fortress. If law enforcement attempted to breach from above, the entire observation deck would collapse into the operating room below, creating a deadly trap. His voice crackled across the hospital's communication systems at 3:08 p.m. His English was flawless, though colored by his Russian accent. "Attention all personnel. This is the authority speaking. I have secured the 3rd and 4th floors of Mercy General Hospital. I have 32 hostages in my possession, including medical staff, patients, and 1 hospital administrator. I have explosives positioned throughout this facility. If any attempt is made to breach my position, all hostages will be executed immediately." In the command center 2 blocks away, police dispatchers and FBI negotiators were already mobilizing. The hospital's director of security had activated emergency protocols. The National Guard was being called. Helicopter units were positioning themselves at strategic distances. A perimeter was being established that would eventually include over 200 law enforcement personnel from federal, state, and local agencies. Continued his broadcast. I have one demand. Colonel, currently detained in the Federal Correctional Institution in Pennsylvania, must be released and transported to the location of my choosing within 4 hours. If this demand is not met, I will begin executing hostages. One hostage every 30 minutes. You will have 30 seconds to prepare yourselves for the consequences of your refusal. The communication cut off. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any threat. Among the 32 hostages pressed into the operating theater, Sarah stood with her hands raised, appearing as terrified as everyone else. But her mind was operating on a completely different frequency. She was conducting a real-time tactical assessment that would have impressed military intelligence analysts. She counted operatives methodically. The man with the old injury in his left leg, the one named who favored his right side when moving under fire, the tall operative with the military tattoo on his neck, communications specialist, the younger one with sweating palms and trembling hands, the psychological weak point, 3 additional operatives positioned at cardinal points, himself serving as command and control. She assessed their weapons: 7 AR-15 assault rifles, 9 tactical pistols distributed among them, 4 fragmentation grenades visible in tactical vests, and what appeared to be 2 additional grenades concealed in his jacket. She mapped their defensive positions with geometric precision. If a breach came from the east, they'd be vulnerable for approximately 2.3 seconds before consolidating their position. If it came from above, the explosives would activate automatically. If it came from the main entrance, the secondary explosive would trigger first, creating a bottleneck. Most critically, Sarah observed psychological state. His hand kept moving to his watch, checking time compulsively. His jaw muscles tensed when he reviewed the communication frequencies. His breathing pattern shifted when he received updates about the police perimeter. Was operating on a deadline. Whatever this operation was supposed to accomplish, it had a specific time frame, and that time frame was creating pressure that was building like a pressure cooker. Sarah positioned herself near a young male doctor whose hands were shaking uncontrollably. When no operatives were looking directly at them, she leaned close enough that her whisper was inaudible to anyone more than 6 inches away. "Listen to my voice only," she breathed. "You're going to survive this. I'm Navy SEAL Team 6, embedded here for 2 years. Help is already deployed outside. Don't panic, don't be a hero, just stay calm and breathe." The doctor's eyes widened with disbelief and desperate hope. Sarah continued, "Tell the others quietly. Pass it on, but be subtle. No one can know I'm not just another hostage." She pulled back before anyone noticed their proximity, returning to her position with appropriate fear and desperation painted across her face. But internally, she was already 3 moves ahead of his operation. She understood his timeline. She understood his weaknesses. And she understood exactly what she needed to do to turn this hostage situation into the greatest intelligence victory of her career. The standoff had begun. The clock was ticking, and Sarah was about to change everything. Over the next 3 hours, Sarah executed a masterpiece of psychological warfare and tactical manipulation that would later be studied in classified military academies across the United States. Her objective was singular and absolute: destabilize operation from within while maintaining her cover as a terrified nurse. Every movement was calculated. Every word was chosen with surgical precision. Every interaction was designed to move the pieces on her internal chessboard closer to checkmate. At 3:47 p.m., a diabetic patient named Mr. Henderson began showing signs of severe hypoglycemia. His blood sugar was dropping dangerously, a legitimate medical emergency that required immediate insulin administration. Sarah approached directly, keeping her voice trembling and her body language submissive. "Commander, that patient is going to die. His blood sugar is critical. I need to retrieve insulin from the pharmacy. Please. He's just an old man. He's not a threat. Studied her face, processing the request. Sarah had calculated that he'd allow it. A professional military operative understood medical emergencies, and killing a hostage unnecessarily would only increase law enforcement pressure. Nodded curtly. Go, will accompany you. If you deviate from your path, he will execute you immediately. This was exactly what Sarah needed. With trailing behind her, rifle held at low ready, Sarah moved through the hospital corridors with apparent urgency while her mind every detail. She noted camera positions. She observed structural vulnerabilities. She identified the precise location where the main explosives were rigged to the stairwell, 3 devices arranged in a configuration that would collapse the entire structure if detonated simultaneously. She mentally photographed the wiring configuration, the timer mechanism, the redundancy systems built into the triggering device. Most importantly, she documented the security weakness in the pharmacy. The electronic lock had been damaged by the initial breach, and the backup mechanical lock was accessible from the service corridor. She could potentially access it without authorization. But more critically, she observed that the pharmacy's surveillance cameras had blind spots, dead zones created by the hospital's aging infrastructure. When they returned to the operating theater with the insulin, Sarah immediately administered the medication with professional competence. The other hostages watched her work, gaining confidence from her calm demeanor. She was no longer just another terrified captive. She was the person who was saving lives. She was the person in control. Noticed this dynamic shift and made a mental note. But he didn't interfere. A confident medical professional was more useful than a panicked one. At 4:23 p.m., made his critical error. He demanded proof that Colonel would actually be released. He needed to establish direct communication with federal negotiators and confirm that the prisoner exchange would proceed as negotiated. This required accessing the hospital's main communication terminal, a secured system in the administrative office that contained encrypted Federal Bureau of Investigation channels, direct lines to the Department of Justice, and real-time intelligence feeds. Sarah volunteered immediately. "I can access the system," she said. "I have administrative credentials from my nursing role. The hospital administration trained me on emergency protocols." Hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. He assigned the operative with the injured left leg to supervise her. Sarah understood the significance of this assignment, was second in command, which meant he trusted her enough to send his most reliable operative. It also meant that would be distracted from his position at the secondary entrance point, creating a tactical vulnerability. Seated at the communication terminal with standing directly behind her, Sarah began executing Phase 2 of her operation. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, but she was deliberately inserting delays into the government's communication response system. She was creating protocol errors that would slow down the prisoner transfer authorization. She was building a sense of frustration and urgency into a psychological state. More importantly, she was accessing a secure protocol that she'd installed during her 2 years of undercover work. A hidden pathway in the hospital's network that would allow her to transmit real-time intelligence directly to Commander Harrison's SEAL team without its communication system detecting the transmission. Every detail she documented, camera positions, explosive placements, guard rotations, psychological deterioration of the younger operative, was being transmitted through encrypted channels that bypassed every security measures team had established. "The system is slow," Sarah said too, her voice genuinely frustrated. "The government is running verification protocols. They're being careful about Colonel's release. It's taking longer than expected." Accepted this explanation. Of course, the American government was being cautious. That was exactly what he would expect from bureaucrats who didn't understand military efficiency. As the afternoon hours stretched toward evening, Sarah continued her double game with increasing sophistication. She moved freely through the hostage area, appearing to provide medical support while actually coaching other captives into psychological stability. She identified which hostages were on the verge of panic and helped them regulate their breathing. She positioned herself strategically so she could observe constantly, monitoring his deteriorating psychological state, watching his hands shake with increasing intensity, noting the way his eyes kept shifting toward the explosives he'd rigged to the observation deck. Was breaking, and Sarah understood that a breaking operative was the most dangerous kind, unpredictable, desperate, capable of irrational actions that would destroy carefully planned operation. By 6:15 p.m., Sarah had transmitted 17 detailed intelligence reports to Commander Harrison's SEAL team. She'd identified every explosive placement. She'd documented every operational detail. She'd provided psychological profiles of each operative. She'd created a tactical map of optimal breach points and assault timing windows. And she'd done it all while standing 5 feet away from professionals trained to kill without hesitation. The trap was being set. The pieces were positioning themselves, and Sarah was orchestrating a symphony of precision that would culminate in either absolute triumph or catastrophic failure. There was no middle ground. There was no compromise. There was only victory or death. At 7:32 p.m., everything changed. Sarah was moving a critical patient, an elderly woman named who suffered from acute kidney failure and required immediate dialysis treatment, toward the service corridor. Her justification was medically sound and practically necessary. Potassium levels were dangerously elevated. Without dialysis within the next 4 hours, she would suffer cardiac arrest. The hospital's dialysis equipment was located in the basement medical wing, accessible through the service corridors that ran parallel to the main structural supports. But Sarah's true objective wasn't medical treatment. She was moving toward the observation deck service access point, the location where she could physically inspect the explosive devices that were rigged to collapse the entire surgical wing if detonated. She needed to verify the exact configuration, confirm the triggering mechanisms, and determine if there were manual override systems that could be accessed during an assault. Had been watching her. For the past 3 hours, he'd been analyzing her behavior with the intensity of a chess studying an opponent's strategy. He'd noticed that she moved with too much confidence. Her reactions to stress were calibrated incorrectly. A terrified civilian would show more disorientation, more desperation, more signs of psychological breakdown. Instead, Sarah moved through the hostage situation with the calculated precision of someone who had extensive training in crisis environments. Her eyes tracked threats and escape routes with military awareness. Her breathing remained steady when other hostages were hyperventilating. Her hands never shook. Had spent 32 years in military intelligence. He recognized training when he saw it. He rose from his command position at 7:34 p.m. and intercepted Sarah in the corridor leading to the service access area. His weapon remained lowered, not a threatening gesture, but a statement of control. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "Stop," he commanded. Sarah stopped. Her mind raced through contingencies, threat assessments, and tactical options, but her external appearance remained that of a frightened nurse caught in an impossible situation. She turned slowly, allowing to lean against the wall for support. "The patient needs dialysis," she said, her voice trembling appropriately. "Her potassium is critical. She'll die without treatment." Stepped closer, his dark eyes studying her face with predatory intensity. "You're not afraid," he observed quietly. "Not truly. You move like a soldier. Your awareness is wrong for a civilian. Your breathing is wrong. Everything about you is wrong." He paused, allowing the weight of his realization to settle between them. "You're military." There was a moment, a suspended fraction of time where Sarah could have attempted deception, could have tried to maintain her cover, could have attempted to convince him that he was mistaken, but was too experienced, too intelligent, too perceptive for lies to work. He'd already reached his conclusion. Attempting to contradict him would only confirm his suspicions with greater certainty. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her operation. "Navy SEAL," she said calmly, her voice dropping the manufactured tremor. "Team 6, 2 years embedded in this facility." His weapon lowered further. For a moment there was complete silence in the corridor. Then unexpectedly a dark smile crossed his face, not an expression of humor but of grim professional recognition. 2 years, he repeated quietly. "You were here when we planned this operation. You documented our movements. You reported our communications." "Everything," Sarah confirmed. "Every detail, every operative, every objective. Your government already knows about Colonel's extraction timeline. They know about the explosives. They know about your team composition. They've known for months." Nodded slowly, processing this information with the acceptance of a warrior who understood that he'd been outmaneuvered. He'd made a critical mistake. He'd allowed Sarah to operate within his operational security perimeter, assuming she was nothing more than a civilian nurse. But she'd been intelligence gathering the entire time. She'd been creating a psychological profile of his team. She'd been documenting every detail that would be necessary for a military response. "You're good," said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "Better than I gave you credit for, if I'd recognized you earlier." "You would have still lost," Sarah interrupted quietly. "My team is already in position. Your communication lines are compromised. Your extraction route is blocked. Your timeline has been anticipated. This operation was over before you entered the building." Absorbed this truth without flinching. A professional soldier understood when he'd been defeated. He understood the calculus of military operations. Sometimes the enemy was simply better prepared, better trained, better positioned. Sometimes you fought with honor and still lost because your opponent was superior. But before could respond, before he could process the implications of his operational failure, gunshots erupted from the west corridor. His voice screamed through the communication headsets. "Commander, surveillance FEADS show military movement on floor 4. They're breaching." The young operative had finally broken. He'd been monitoring the hospital's external security cameras, and he'd seen the subtle signs of military positioning that Sarah had deliberately revealed, indirect indicators designed to trigger exactly this response. Had panicked, and panicked operatives do only one thing. They kill. 3 gunshots echoed through the surgical wing as began executing hostages in a desperate attempt to reduce the government's leverage. A patient collapsed, then a nurse, then another hostage fell screaming to the floor. The negotiation was finished. The standoff was over. The real battle was about to begin, and Sarah had just made the decision that would transform her from covert operative to active combatant in a fight that would determine the fate of everyone in this hospital. Sarah didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She didn't calculate odds or consider consequences. Instead, she moved with the absolute conviction of a warrior who understood that the moment for subtlety had passed. She lunged directly at, her hand striking upward in a precise arc designed to disarm him. Her fingers connected with his wrist at exactly the right angle, a pressure point strike that forced his nervous system to involuntarily release his grip on the assault rifle. The weapon clattered to the hospital floor. Simultaneously, Sarah's other hand moved to her wrist and pressed the emergency activation sequence on her military-grade watch. The signal was instantaneous, unencrypted, and absolutely clear. "Breach now. Full assault. Go, go, go." "Breach now," she screamed, her voice projecting with parade-ground authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. "All teams engage." The hospital erupted into controlled fury. Flashbangs detonated on every floor simultaneously, military-grade stun grenades designed to disorient and incapacitate without causing permanent injury. The explosions were concussive, brilliant, and absolutely devastating to anyone not wearing specialized protective equipment. The operatives in the surgical wing were thrown backward by the percussive force. Alarms screamed. Emergency lighting flickered and stabilized. The entire structure seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the assault. Then came the SEAL team. Commander James Harrison emerged from the stairwell at the head of 12 elite operators moving with the precision of a lethal organism. They wore tactical body armor, advanced helmets with thermal imaging capabilities, and carried suppressed assault rifles that eliminated threats with surgical accuracy. These were men who had trained together for thousands of hours. These were warriors who had seen actual combat in multiple theaters of war. These were professionals who understood that hesitation resulted in casualties. Sarah moved immediately into tactical formation alongside them, her body language shifting from terrified nurse to combat operator in the space of a single breath. She wore no tactical vest, no helmet, no protective gear, just scrubs and determination. But Harrison recognized her instantly and gestured her into the assault element without hesitation. She was his intelligence asset. She was his tactical guide. She was his inside advantage. Room-by-room clearance, Harrison commanded through his radio. Watch for explosives. Guide us to primary hostile locations. Sarah sprinted forward, her intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout becoming their greatest tactical advantage. She'd spent 731 days studying every corridor, every exit, every structural element. She knew that would be positioned near the secondary eastern entrance, the location with the best defensive sight lines. She knew that would attempt to consolidate his position near the communications terminal. She knew that the psychologically unstable operative who'd begun executing hostages would be in the surgical observation deck, likely attempting to detonate the explosives out of desperation. Primary threat northeast corridor 20 meters, she shouted, pointing. Operative named left leg injury, right side favoring. Secondary entrance behind him. He'll attempt to fall back and consolidate. 2 SEAL operators peeled off from the main element, moving with lethal efficiency towards position. The operative had seconds to process what was happening. The stun grenades had left him disoriented, his hearing damaged by the percussive blasts, his tactical positioning suddenly compromised by hostile forces who seemed to know exactly where he was positioned. He attempted to bring his weapon to bear. He made it approximately 2/3 of the way through the motion before the SEALs engaged him with controlled precision. 2 rounds, center mass, professional placement, collapsed without firing a shot. In the surgical observation deck, was reaching for the detonation trigger with trembling, panicked fingers. Sarah saw the movement before anyone else could react. She launched herself forward in a perfectly executed flying knee strike, a technique refined through thousands of hours of combat training. Her knee connected with shoulder joint at precisely the correct angle, dislocating his arm with a sickening crack while simultaneously knocking him backward through a surgical light fixture. The detonation trigger fell from his nerveless fingers and skittered across the floor. A SEAL operator swept in immediately, neutralizing with 2 controlled rounds before he could attempt any secondary action. The threat was eliminated. The explosives remained armed but undetonated. The observation deck was secured. Attempted to barricade himself in the communications room, but Sarah provided the override code to the electronic lock system. The door opened in 2.3 seconds. 3 SEAL operators moved through the entrance in perfect formation, their weapons trained on his position. Assessed the situation with professional clarity. He was outmaneuvered and positioned in a room with no viable escape route. He placed his weapon on the ground and raised his hands in surrender. The remaining 2 operatives, support personnel stationed near the main entrance, surrendered without resistance when they realized their command structure had collapsed and they were surrounded by the world's most lethal soldiers. Stood in the corridor with his hands visible, completely disarmed both literally and tactically. He locked eyes with Sarah for a moment, a gaze that communicated a warrior's acknowledgement of defeat. He'd been beaten by an opponent he'd underestimated. He'd been outmaneuvered by a soldier whose tactical preparation exceeded his own. He'd lost because Sarah was better trained, better prepared, and better positioned. He knelt slowly and placed his hands behind his head. The firefight lasted exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds from initial breach to final surrender. 3 operatives were permanently neutralized, 2 were secured in custody, was restrained, and 30 of the original 32 hostages remained alive. Sarah stood breathing heavily in the corridor, still wearing blood-splattered scrubs, her combat training overriding her medical instincts. Around her, SEAL operators were securing the scene, medics were rushing toward the wounded, and federal agents were beginning the process of documenting the most significant counterterrorism operation conducted on American soil in the past 5 years. Commander Harrison approached her and embraced her fiercely, not a gesture of casual greeting, but an expression of absolute respect between warriors who had just conducted a perfect operation together. 24 months, he said quietly. You stayed in that deep. 24 months, Sarah confirmed, her voice steady despite the adrenaline crash beginning to assault her nervous system. The hospital began its transformation into a crime scene, and Sarah understood that her life as a civilian was permanently over. The hospital cafeteria was eerily quiet compared to the chaos that had consumed the building just 3 hours earlier. Sarah sat alone at a corner table, still wearing scrubs that were now stained with blood, some of it belonging to operatives, some of it belonging to hostages, some of it belonging to her from a knife wound on her left forearm that she'd sustained during the assault but hadn't registered until the adrenaline began fatting from her system. A nurse she'd worked beside for 2 years approached tentatively, carrying a medical kit. "Commander, I need to." "Just Sarah," she interrupted gently. "Please, I'm not anyone's commander yet." The nurse's hands trembled as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. Sarah noticed the other woman's eyes were red from crying, her expression a mixture of trauma and something else, a kind of awe, as if she was treating a celebrity rather than a colleague she'd shared countless 12-hour shifts with. "I still can't believe." The nurse began, then stopped, unable to articulate the cognitive dissonance between the Sarah who'd listened to her personal problems during break time and the Sarah who'd fought armed operatives with lethal precision. Before Sarah could respond, a figure appeared in the cafeteria doorway. Commander James Harrison moved with the controlled authority of a man accustomed to operating in the highest levels of military command. His tactical gear was partially removed, revealing a muscular frame covered in scars that represented 2 decades of combat operations across multiple continents. His eyes found Sarah immediately, and he crossed the cafeteria with purposeful strides. The nurse excused herself quickly, understanding intuitively that this conversation required privacy. Harrison embraced Sarah with fierce intensity, not a casual gesture, but a full-body embrace that communicated absolute respect between warriors who had just conducted a flawless operation together. When he released her, his eyes were slightly moist. 24 months, he said quietly. You stayed in that deep. 24 months, Sarah confirmed. Her voice remained steady, but the emotional weight of those words, the exhaustion, the isolation, the constant performance, the pressure of maintaining a false identity while documenting terrorism, suddenly became tangible. She felt the weight of 2 years settling onto her shoulders like a physical force. The entire time, waiting for this moment. "Well, you made it count," Harrison said, settling into a chair across from her. "The intelligence you provided was extraordinary. 32 operatives across 5 states have been arrested based on your documentation. Safe houses in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York have been raided. Financial networks have been frozen. You just dismantled an entire terrorist cell that we've been tracking for 3 years." Sarah nodded, processing this information. She'd known intellectually that her undercover work was significant, but hearing it confirmed by her commanding officer made it real in a way that concrete facts couldn't capture. She'd sacrificed 2 years of her life, 2 years of genuine human connection, 2 years of personal relationships, 2 years of living as someone she wasn't, and that sacrifice had produced tangible results that would protect American civilians. Around them, the hospital was being transformed into a controlled crime scene. FBI agents were photographing evidence. Military intelligence personnel were securing communication devices and documentation. Federal marshals were managing the custody of the surviving operatives. Hospital administrators were being debriefed about the extent of the damage and the timeline for reopening. News crews were gathering outside, already broadcasting preliminary reports about the hostage situation and the mysterious military response. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. She understood the operational reality. Her cover was destroyed. Her undercover assignment was terminated. Her life as a civilian nurse was permanently concluded. But the psychological implications of that transition were still settling into her consciousness. "That depends on what you want," Harrison said carefully. "You can return to active SEAL duty. You can pursue advanced intelligence work. You can take time for recovery and psychological evaluation. Or," he paused, letting the implications hang between them, "Admiral Jackson wants to meet with you. He's been reviewing your operational documentation, and he has a proposal that might interest you." Before Sarah could respond, the hospital administrator, a man named Dr. Robert Mitchell, who'd been among the hostages, appeared in the cafeteria doorway. His face was pale, his hand still trembling slightly, but his expression was determined. He crossed directly to Sarah's table, and Harrison rose respectfully, understanding that this conversation was between civilians and the person who'd saved their lives. "I needed to thank you," Dr. Mitchell said, his voice breaking slightly. "I don't know what you actually are or what you actually do, but I know that you saved us. You saved 30 people today." Sarah stood and embraced him, a gesture of genuine human connection that felt more authentic than anything she'd done in 2 years. "I was just doing my job," she said quietly. "No," Mitchell replied firmly. "Your job was something much larger than that, and I'll never forget it." After he left, Sarah returned to her chair. Other hospital staff began approaching her, doctors she'd worked with, nurses she'd shared shifts with, patients whose lives she'd touched during her time working in the trauma department. Each interaction was surreal. They saw her as a hero. They saw her as a nurse who'd been secretly a soldier all along. They saw her as impossible, a contradiction that disrupted their understanding of reality. But Sarah saw only the weight of her choices. She'd lied to all of them. She'd built relationships under false pretenses. She'd accepted their trust while withholding fundamental truths about her identity. Yes, she'd saved their lives, but she'd also violated their trust in ways they would never fully comprehend. By 11:47 p.m., the hospital had been secured, the scene processed, and the immediate crisis resolved. Sarah stood alone in the corridor where she'd confronted just hours earlier. Blood stains marked the floor. Bullet holes decorated the walls. The structural damage from the explosives would require extensive repairs. She thought about her 2 years embedded in this facility, the relationships she'd cultivated, the trust she'd earned under false pretenses, the sacrifice of her authentic self to maintain an operational cover. She thought about, now in federal custody, understanding that he'd been defeated by an enemy he'd fatally underestimated. And she understood that her life had fundamentally changed. There was no going back to being a nurse. There was no returning to civilian existence. The woman she'd been before this operation was gone forever, transformed into something else entirely. The real battle, the internal one, was just beginning. The secure facility in Arlington, Virginia, was intentionally anonymous, a nondescript concrete building that could have housed insurance offices or government contractors. Instead, it contained some of the most sensitive intelligence analysis operations in the United States. Sarah was escorted through multiple security checkpoints by armed personnel who her identity at least 5 times before allowing her passage into the classified briefing room. The room itself was deliberately designed to be psychologically intimidating. No windows, reinforced concrete walls, a single conference table surrounded by chairs occupied by representatives from the National Security Agency, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Defense, and Military Intelligence. At the head of the table sat Admiral Jackson, a man with silver hair, piercing blue eyes, and the weathered appearance of someone who'd spent 4 decades making impossible decisions in classified environments. "Commander," Admiral Jackson began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "thank you for your service. Your undercover operation at Mercy General Hospital has provided intelligence that extends far beyond the immediate terrorist cell we neutralized yesterday. We need you to walk us through everything you documented during your 24 months of embedded operations." What followed was 18 hours of continuous debriefing, conducted across 3 separate sessions. Sarah detailed everything with the precision of someone trained to remember operational specifics under extreme stress. She described the initial infiltration of the hospital supply chain by terrorist operatives, a systematic process designed to establish logistical networks that would support larger operations. She identified specific individuals by name, physical description, and operational pattern. She detailed financial flows that traced back to terrorist funding networks operating through shell corporations in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Most critically, she described the hospital's role in a much larger conspiracy. It wasn't just about one hostage situation at one facility. The terrorism cell had infiltrated multiple medical institutions across 12 states. They'd been establishing supply chain networks, creating communication infrastructure, and positioning operatives in strategic locations across American civilian infrastructure. The hospital was merely one node in a much larger network, designed to create maximum disruption and casualties if activated simultaneously. The intelligence was staggering in its scope and implications. By hour 16 of the debriefing, the scope of the investigation had expanded exponentially. NSA analysts began cross-referencing Sarah's documentation with intercepted communications that they'd previously flagged as suspicious but couldn't connect to specific threats. FBI field offices in 5 states were mobilizing. Homeland Security was coordinating with local law enforcement. By hour 18, federal agents had already executed warrants at 7 locations. The arrests began cascading almost immediately. An operative named, no relation to the colonel whose release had demanded, was captured at a safe house in New Jersey with documentation detailing infiltration plans for 14 additional hospitals across the Northeast. A supply chain coordinator named was apprehended at an airport in Pennsylvania, attempting to flee the country with financial records that detailed the entire funding network. A communications specialist named Anna was arrested at her apartment in New York, with encrypted drives containing operational plans that extended across the next 5 years. Within 48 hours of the hospital incident, the entire terrorist network began imploding. Sarah's 2 years of careful documentation, photographs of suspicious deliveries, recordings of overheard conversations, notes about unusual personnel movements, created a detailed tactical picture that allowed federal agencies to anticipate operatives' movements before they made them. Safe houses were raided before operatives could evacuate. Financial accounts were frozen before funds could be transferred. Communications networks were intercepted before messages could be transmitted. The cascading arrests continued for 6 days. 23 operatives were captured. 41 suspected facilitators were detained for questioning. 7 safe houses were secured. 3 potential attack sites were identified and secured before operational activation. The terrorist network that had been meticulously constructed over 5 years was completely dismantled in less than a week. By the seventh day of debriefing, Admiral Jackson conducted a private meeting with Sarah in his office. The Admiral's expression was different from the cold professionalism of the initial briefings. Now there was something else, respect mixed with a kind of paternal concern. "You've done something extraordinary," Admiral Jackson said quietly. "In my 42 years of military service, I've supervised dozens of undercover operations. None have produced intelligence of this caliber. None have required this degree of personal sacrifice." Sarah remained silent, unsure how to respond to the Admiral's assessment. "The question now," Admiral Jackson continued, "is what happens next. Command has several options available to you. You can return to active SEAL duty with a substantial promotion, commander rank, command of your own team. You can pursue advanced intelligence work within the CIA or NSA, likely in a supervisory capacity. You can take extended medical leave and psychological evaluation. Or—" He paused, letting the weight of the alternative settle between them. "Or," Admiral Jackson continued, "you can pursue a proposal that I've been developing. The terrorist network you just dismantled wasn't unique. It was one of at least 17 similar networks operating across American civilian infrastructure. Hospitals, power plants, water treatment facilities, transportation hubs, terrorist organizations are systematically infiltrating critical infrastructure across the country. We need someone who understands how these networks operate, someone who can identify infiltration patterns before they become active threats, someone who can coordinate counterintelligence operations across multiple agencies." He pulled a classified folder across his desk. "I'm proposing you establish and command a new division, the Counterinfrastructure Threat Assessment Division. You'd have authority over resources across multiple agencies. You'd report directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You'd have access to classified intelligence from every major agency. Your mission would be simple: identify terrorist cells embedded in civilian infrastructure before they can activate, and neutralize them before American civilians are threatened." Sarah understood the implications. This wasn't a return to field operations. This was an administrative role that would require her to spend her career analyzing intelligence, coordinating between agencies, and making strategic decisions that would determine the safety of millions of Americans. It was also recognition of her extraordinary capabilities and the value of her undercover sacrifice. "I'll need time to consider," Sarah said finally. "You have 48 hours, Admiral Jackson replied, "but I suspect you already know what you're going to choose." He was right. Sarah already understood her decision. Over the next 6 days, Sarah underwent extensive psychological evaluation. Military psychiatrists assessed the trauma of 2 years in deep cover, the psychological impact of maintaining a false identity, the emotional cost of sacrificing genuine human connections. Their conclusion was unanimous. She was psychologically resilient beyond standard military parameters. She would require periodic counseling and stress management, but she was fundamentally operational. On day 7, Sarah reported to Admiral Jackson's office and gave him her answer. The choice was made. The path was chosen. And the next phase of her extraordinary military career was about to begin. Commander Sarah stood before a wall of classified files in her new office at the Pentagon's Counterterrorism Division. The nameplate on her door read simply, "Commander Sarah, Director, Counterinfrastructure Threat Assessment Division." Below it in smaller letters, "Authorized Access, Top Secret SCI." The office itself was deliberately austere. Functional furniture, secured computers, a single window overlooking the Potomac River. It was a workspace designed for serious work, not for comfortable contemplation. The hospital incident was already becoming legendary in military intelligence circles. Classified case studies had been prepared and distributed to every major military academy, every intelligence training facility, every special operations command. The operation was analyzed from tactical perspectives, strategic perspectives, and psychological perspectives. Sarah's 2 years of undercover work was being dissected, studied, and held up as an example of extraordinary dedication to duty. But for Sarah, it represented only the beginning of something much larger. She opened her first classified portfolio. The file was marked Eyes Only and contained intelligence briefings about 17 active terrorist networks operating within American civilian infrastructure. The first network was operating through hospitals in the Northeast, similar to the Mercy General Cell, but more sophisticated, better funded, and apparently coordinated with international terrorist organizations in Syria and Afghanistan. The second network had infiltrated power plant security systems across the Midwest, positioning operatives in locations where they could potentially disable critical electrical infrastructure serving millions of civilians. The third network was embedded in water treatment facilities across the South, with documentation suggesting they were developing chemical dispersal capabilities. The scope was catastrophic. Sarah read through the briefings with methodical precision, her mind cataloging details, identifying patterns, recognizing the signature methodology of operatives who'd been trained by the same organizations that had orchestrated the Mercy General operation. The intelligence analysis indicated that if even one of these networks achieved operational activation simultaneously, the casualties could reach into the hundreds of thousands. American civilian infrastructure was more vulnerable than the general population realized. She picked up her secure phone and called her division's senior leadership team, a carefully selected group of operatives, analysts, and coordinators who'd been handpicked from various federal agencies specifically for this assignment. "This is," she said simply, "we have work to do. I want complete intelligence packages on all 17 networks prepared within 72 hours. I want field assets in place for observation and documentation. I want every phone number, every address, every financial transaction traced. We're going to identify these networks before they activate. We're going to neutralize them before American civilians are threatened. We're going to prove that dark networks cannot hide in plain sight as long as we're watching." The team understood the magnitude of the assignment. This wasn't routine counterterrorism work. This was preventive intelligence operations on a scale that most analysts had never attempted. This was about identifying threats before they materialized, disrupting terrorist organizations before they could execute their plans, and protecting millions of Americans from dangers they would never even know existed. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah's division began executing an intelligence operation of extraordinary complexity. Field assets were positioned in hospitals, power plants, and water treatment facilities. Communications networks were monitored using classified surveillance technology. Financial transactions were traced through international banking systems. Personnel databases were cross-referenced with known terrorist operatives and suspicious individuals. The work was meticulous, precise, and absolutely focused on gathering evidence that would allow federal agencies to arrest suspects before they could activate their operational plans. The results were remarkable. By week 3, Sarah's team had identified 47 individuals with confirmed connections to terrorist organizations. By week 4, they documented specific operational objectives for 13 of the 17 networks. By week 5, federal agencies were executing coordinated arrests across multiple states simultaneously. The cascading arrests continued for months. Each interrogation provided additional intelligence that allowed Sarah's team to identify new networks, new operatives, new potential threats. The Counterinfrastructure Threat Assessment Division became the most effective counterterrorism organization in American history, successfully preventing what intelligence analysts estimated would have resulted in over 2 million civilian casualties if the terrorist networks had achieved simultaneous operational activation. Sarah's reputation in military and intelligence circles became almost mythical. The nurse, who was a SEAL, had transformed into a strategic leader who could think like a terrorist operative, anticipate threats before they materialized, and coordinate complex intelligence operations across multiple federal agencies. She was promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral by her third year in command. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, though the ceremony was classified and her achievements couldn't be publicly discussed. But for Sarah, the accolades and promotions were secondary. What mattered was the mission. What mattered was identifying threats before they could harm American civilians. What mattered was understanding that her 2 years of sacrifice, the lies, the false identities, the relationships built under false pretenses, had created the foundation for something extraordinary. Late one evening, standing in her Pentagon office as the sun set over Washington, D.C., Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the day she'd entered the trauma department at Mercy General Hospital as an undercover operative. She thought about the 731 days of maintaining a false identity while documenting terrorism. She thought about the moment when had recognized her true nature and the chaos that had followed. She thought about the commando who'd stormed the hospital expecting an easy victory, unaware that the nurse he'd encountered was a decorated Navy SEAL trained to operate in exactly these conditions. She thought about the intelligence she'd gathered, the networks she'd dismantled, the civilians she'd protected. Through her office window, the Washington Monument glowed against the evening sky like a beacon of freedom. Sarah understood her true mission now, the mission that would define the entire arc of her military career. She would hunt threats that others couldn't see. She would dismantle networks operating in the shadows of American civilian infrastructure. She would prepare the next generation of operators for the hidden wars being fought silently across the nation. She would ensure that Americans could live their lives safely, protected by warriors operating in classified shadows, fighting battles that would never be publicly acknowledged. Sarah, the woman who'd been a nurse, who'd been a SEAL, who'd been an undercover operative, had finally become what she was always meant to be. A strategic leader protecting her nation from threats most citizens would never understand. The real war, the invisible war, was being won one classified operation at a time. And Sarah was leading the charge into darkness, guided by nothing but the absolute conviction that her nation was worth protecting, that her people were worth dying for, and that some battles had to be fought in shadows so that others could live in the light. The hospital incident had been a beginning, but this was her destiny. The end.